quick, find the podcast. It won't be that hard to find one since it seems like every single YouTuber has their own podcast. From the big boys like Logan Paul and Joe Rogan to your uncle who definitely should not have access to a microphone, it seems like every single person has a podcast. And since the market is so oversaturated, that means that the market is very competitive. I mean, just hop on to Joe Rogan's podcast featuring Elon Musk talking about his plans to nuke Venezuela. It seems like every single podcast is becoming more and more big and with bigger and bigger guests. But then there's...
Boneless or bone?
Bone.
Boneless. Boneless, man.
Boneless.
I'm a boneless kind of guy, man. I'm a boneless kind of guy.
Get that bone out of there. If I can't eat it, get it out of my face.
Sometimes I just don't want to go through the process of being like a fucking
Thank
animal
you.
and tearing this shit limb
Thank you.
from limb.
It tastes
I'm
better.
not.
I just
no,
want
it
it
doesn't,
tastes
bro.
better. Full of shit.
You're
It tastes
like
better.
you're like
You
trying to
are-
play Doom Eternal with this
What
chicken.
are you talking
I do
You
not.
are full of shit.
What are you talking about?
Even with all this craziness, it seems like Trash Taste has stayed at one of the biggest podcasts, even though they're not at the levels that other podcasts are. But why is this? Well, I can pinpoint it down to 3 reasons. The first one being... Now, like I said, big podcasts bring on big people, you know, people like Elon Musk, Neil deGrasse Tyson. It just seems like they're bringing on whoever is big and whoever they feel like. But in Trash Taste, that's not the case. Now, aside from the international episodes, close to all guests featured on the show have less subscribers than the Trash Taste members, meaning that they're not bringing them on because they're big. They're bringing them on either because they fit the episode's specific topic or they're just simply friends with them. And even some guests like Chris Broad are reoccurring. He's shown, I believe, around 4 times, meaning that some guests are even so good that they're bringing them back on even though they're not that big compared to other guests that may have come onto the show. And this is very important because when you bring on guests that are just there because they're big, it doesn't really have a connection with the podcast members themselves because they're just there, like I said, because they're big. But if it's the podcast members' actual friends, they could bring up interesting stories of how they met, interactions they had with each other, you know, stuff like that can be very interesting. And that brings me on to my second point. Even though big podcasts bring on big guests who have lots of followers, that necessarily doesn't make it interesting. This is because many of the things they talk about may not be in our interest and does not relate to a big group of people. But on Trash Taste, the topics are very relatable. I mean, all the Trash Taste members came from normal lives before they started YouTube. And even when they started YouTube, they still live very normal lives, especially to their viewership. All of them grew up in either Australia or England, and then they moved to Japan, which seems big, but if you think about it, it's not really a big deal. So because of that, they're very relatable. Having conversations about fighting about food, their feelings on America, these are very simple and incomplex topics, yet they're very interesting to watch. Think of any podcast that's big, like how I've always brought up Joe Rogan. Have you ever watched them? I personally have, and I do not enjoy them because when you click on it, you're like, oh my god, it's Elon Musk. I wonder what he has to say. But then you actually watch it, and it's just not interesting because it's not really something that most of us care about and only a few people care about. And that's what happens with these podcasts, is that when you bring on big guests from all around the world, only the people who care about those specific people will watch. But with Trash Taste, no matter what guest they bring on, it'll always be interesting because of the relatability. Anyone can understand what they're talking about. And this also makes it interesting because since we can relate to it, we can have a feeling of, oh, that could happen to me, or maybe that did happen to me. And relatability with other podcasts is something people mostly overlook, especially since the market is very competitive. I feel like most podcasters and YouTubers in general just have a feeling of, oh, I need to be bigger and better. And they really overlook simple things like relatability. And relatability brings me on to my third point. Because they're relatable, they're very shareable. I mean, I know some people who have never heard of Trash Taste Boys, but when I bring them up, they're like, oh yeah, I've seen a clip from them. And this really shows how relatability can help with something being so shareable. And channels like the clip channels, which it seems like every podcast channel has, makes it very easy to share these clips. And because they're relatable, they're very easy to bundle up and give it out to just whoever feels like watching it, even if they never heard of any of the members or the guests on the podcast. And this brings me on to what I said before. Even if there are big guests, only those niche people care about it. Therefore, it's not shareable. Because who's gonna care about anything that these people have to say? But with Trash Taste, it's something that everyone can understand. So these clips and the podcast episodes themselves are something that is very easily clickable. And then there's something like the specials, which is something that they do outside of the studio. And even though these are way more grand and big than the podcast episodes themselves, they're still relatable because it's something that you can do. Therefore, they're very shareable, and same for the live streams. It's basically just some boys sitting down talking about whatever. Now, there's something I want to mention. When the podcast was first created, it was on the ground basis of an anime podcast. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be that, but that's what they said, so it would entice people to come in. But as you can see, they rarely talk about anime. I mean, I personally don't even like anime, yet I bought their merch. And that shows these people have really branched out to just whatever they feel like they're talking. Therefore, people like me, who don't even like the anime content that the YouTubers create, can watch the show. And guest stars like Chris Broad, which is the personal reason why I started watching them, entices people to come in and watch their other episodes, creating this sort of loop of watching their things just because of this one guest came on one time. So if you have a feeling of watching a podcast that's different than the other podcasts because you feel maybe tired of the same format for the other podcasts, I definitely recommend watching Trash Taste. Maybe start off with the Clips channel because that way you could see the most interesting stuff that they picked out. But then maybe actually branch out to the long episodes. And also shout out to Trash Taste because they make a very entertaining series, and the YouTubers themselves on their individuals actually make very interesting content as well. And that is one of the reasons why the podcast got big in the first place. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subs by the end of the year, even though it's already the 28th, but we may be able to do it. Anyways, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.